number one talk radio station.
Dubai Eye 103.8.
Right then, part two now of our interview with Professor Sir Cary Cooper of the Alliance Manchester Business School. Who he and why do we care? He's talking about the hybrid working versus the 5-day week. Now, you may recall we talked about this at some length last week after Amazon became the latest firm to instruct workers to go back to the office 5 days a week. Fine, we were kind of done and dusted with the conversation, but then I read comments from this guy over the back end of last week, calling Amazon and companies like it dinosaurs for embracing this policy. And I thought, that's interesting. Who's he? We'd like to hear from him. It turns out he's a world authority on this and has been for decades. He's an American guy, but he's been in the UK for decades at the Alliance Manchester Business School. And he was knighted for his work on organisational behavioural psychology, hence the Professor Sir Cary Cooper. So I thought, see if we can get him on the phone and talk to him. He's 85, but sharp as a knife, and I had a long conversation with him. If you're a fan of the 5-day week, as a boss, you might want to turn off now because he absolutely gives it both barrels. So the guys upstairs at Amazon, sorry. Ajaz, our regular listener, sorry. You're probably not going to like what he has to say. But this was Professor Sir Cary's thoughts on Amazon's return to a 5-day week.
Okay, there aren't many companies doing it, incidentally. I think the ones that are doing it have more of a command and control kind of culture. You know, they're mandating that people go back. They haven't looked at the evidence, and the evidence is quite clear. Why commute into London or any major capital for an hour and a half and an hour and a half back? The employer loses 3-4 hours a day. It's ridiculous. And not only that, it's costly in a cost of living crisis globally. So really, it makes absolutely no sense. So my own view is the companies that are doing it have just old-fashioned management style. They're just people who don't get it, don't understand the Z generation, don't understand the young millennials who want the flexibility, are IT savvy, who know how to do this, will deliver to the bottom line, and the evidence is they will. So why would you drag them back into the office unless you wanted all your troops there just to demonstrate that you're the boss? There's no evidential backing to that argument. But, you know, it's not about evidence. They somehow think, and they'll talk about the water cooler effect, that ideas come and go, you know, when people having a cup of coffee and a cup of tea. And I agree, that is the case. But people working flexibly, going to the work 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, some weeks, maybe 1 or 2 another week, it doesn't make any difference. They will meet their colleagues because they are motivated for the social connectedness, because that's what we learned during the pandemic. What people suffered from being locked away is they miss their colleagues and talk to their colleagues. But you need to do that 5 days a week? Not necessarily, no. Why?
Well, in terms of some of the things that, for example, Andy Jassy mentioned of Amazon and others, Jamie Dimon, they talk about collaboration. They talk about mentoring in particular. The younger people or people starting off in their careers need that physical presence of just learning on the job. What's your reaction to that?
Oh, I totally agree. I think the younger people do need that. And by the way, the younger people are asking for flexibility. That's the irony. But the younger people are saying, yes, I need that. And they will go into the office. And what will happen will be they'll start with an employer and they'll go in 5 days a week. Once they get to know the culture, get some help from the senior people who will be around, by the way, they're not staying at home. It's not a question of remote working versus coming in the office 5 days a week. We're not talking about people staying at home 5 days a week. We're talking about flexible working. So what the young people will get is gradually they'll maybe come in longer when they first join the organization. Then they'll start working more flexibly, but they'll get the access to the senior people anyway, because they'll be in. And some of the older people will be in a lot more in any case, because they get their social needs met, particularly if they're kind of over 50. That's where they'll want to be in probably more, and they're of the generation who think they should be in. So they'll go in any case. So flexibility is good. The evidence is just overwhelming. I mean, it's not even close. The real issue, I think, with it is that there are people in an organization who can't work flexibly. They have to be at the coalface. You know, paste assembly line workers, doctors, nurses in hospital, bus drivers, pilots, etc. What do we do for them? And, that is a real interesting issue. And in my view, where we ought to go in that direction, which other organizations are thinking about now and other countries are thinking about it, which is the 4-day working week or the 4-day short compressed week of 4 10-hour days. So there's a way we should benefit the people who can't work flexibly. We need to do that, I think, particularly if they're in highly stressed jobs like paste assembly line workers, like doctors and nurses, like bus drivers, like all the people I just mentioned. So I think we have an opportunity to change the nature of work. I mean, that was the reset. The good part of the pandemic has made us rethink what's work all about. Don't we want good work-life balance? Don't we want to retain good people? There's no way the Z generation of young millennials are going to work for an employer who says in the advert, you have to be in 5 days a week. They're gone. I mean, they're going to lose talent, those organizations.
Well, let's talk about the evidence that you mentioned. A lot of the questions we get in when we have talked about this is, well, what is the evidence about productivity of hybrid versus being in 5 days a week? You've talked about the evidence.
I think the productivity one is a difficult one. I'll tell you why, because it's difficult to measure. How do you measure the productivity of a manager, for example? So productivity is where you can measure it. The evidence is it produces a much more productive workforce. Incidentally, if you look at the studies done in Sweden, in Gothenburg, where they, for 2 years, put people on 4-day working week, i.e. 32 hours versus 40-hour week, right? Half of them, they were matched. Half of them were and they did it for 2 whole years. The ones on 32-hour week contracts, i.e. a 4-day working week, were more productive. They looked at productivity. They were able to measure that group in terms of its actual productivity. So the evidence, I think, is getting there on the productivity, but the difficulty is how do you measure in professional services productivity? Very difficult. But you can measure it in call centers and a range of other places. And in those kind of scenarios where you can measure it, but the evidence we still need to collect evidence. But we have evidence clearly on the health benefits. If people are healthier, they're more likely to be more productive than people who are not healthier. But evidence is still needed on the productivity per capita. But I think we're going to find it. We certainly do know if people consistently work long hours, they will be less productive. And if you go into an office environment, it's very difficult to leave at 5 p.m.
Sir Cary Cooper there, who is from the University of Manchester, the man who coined the phrase presenteeism, giving us his thoughts on the 5-day versus 4-day working week.
Dubai Eye 103.